Hello, everyone. This morning at 9:23 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed a joint session of Parliament and gave a speech that completely overturned the power balance in the ongoing U.S.-Canada standoff, leaving the White House struggling to grasp how drastically the situation has changed. For the past 5 weeks, the United States has been issuing demands, issuing threats, and anticipating that Canada would ultimately give in. Today, Carney turned the tables entirely. In a 22-minute speech carried live throughout North America and globally, he presented the United States with an ultimatum. He listed 5 precise steps the U.S. must complete within the coming 14 days if it wishes to prevent a lasting breakdown in bilateral ties. He emphasized that these are not open to discussion. They represent the absolute minimum Canada requires even to think about restarting diplomatic contact. He made it very clear, if these conditions are not fulfilled by March 18, 2026, Canada will roll out a set of economic and strategic responses that will make the present tensions seem trivial. The dynamic has flipped. No longer is the United States setting terms for Canada. Now, Canada is setting terms for the United States. The mere fact that Carney delivered this ultimatum openly on the floor of Parliament reveals just how much the leverage has shifted in the last month. In this analysis, I'll go through each of Carney's 5 demands and explain why every one of them marks a firm boundary Canada refuses to cross. I'll outline the exact repercussions Carney warned would follow if the United States misses the deadline. I'll cover the immediate reaction from the White House and why staff there are calling this move a diplomatic Pearl Harbor. I'll explain the reasoning behind Carney choosing this precise moment for the ultimatum and why the 14-day window was deliberately selected to apply maximum pressure on Trump. And I'll lay out 3 possible outcomes for what unfolds on March 18th once the clock runs out. Subscribe to stay part of the discussion. Drop a comment so we can continue the conversation, and share this video if it provided real insight. Let me guide you through Carney's address to Parliament, because each portion was carefully crafted to project Canadian resolve and expose American exposure. Carney began by speaking straight to Canadians. He declared, "For 5 weeks, we have faced threats against our sovereignty, assaults on our economy, and efforts to force us into a subordinate position. We answered with patience, careful strategy, and backing from allies who see that Canada's struggle involves core principles vital to every democracy. We have proven Canada can endure intense pressure. We have proven Canada can develop options apart from American partnership. And we have proven Canada will never trade its independence for short-term relief from measures that should never have been applied." The chamber burst into applause. Carney paused until quiet returned, then pressed on. But patience is not unlimited. Canada has exhausted every avenue to allow for diplomatic solutions. We put forward compromises. We pursued talks. We exercised restraint even while our sovereignty was challenged and our economy targeted. The United States has turned down every reasonable attempt at negotiation. Yesterday, during my conversation with President Trump, I reached the conclusion that the present administration cannot treat Canada as an equal. So Canada is finished waiting. Canada is finished bargaining from a place of presumed weakness. The time has come for the United States to recognize that resolution of this crisis will only happen on terms that honor Canadian sovereignty and Canadian priorities. Carney then laid out the 5 demands. He stated, if the United States wants to rebuild a working relationship with Canada, these actions must be completed by March 18, 2026 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. These are not suggestions. These are requirements. The chamber fell utterly still. Demand 1, total elimination of all tariffs on Canadian goods. Carney said, every tariff the United States placed on Canadian products must be lifted at once and without any qualifications. No gradual reductions, no carve-outs, no strings attached. Those tariffs violated USMCA rules. They disappear completely, or there will be no way forward. Demand 2, a formal written pledge on NORAD and intelligence cooperation. Carney said, The United States must deliver a signed, legally binding assurance that NORAD will function at full strength, that joint defense commitments will be upheld, and that Five Eyes intelligence sharing will resume without delay. This pledge must carry the signature of President Trump along with countersignatures from the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence. It must contain explicit clauses blocking any unilateral American withdrawal or change without Canada's agreement. Demand 3, a public disavowal of sovereignty threats. Carney said, President Trump must deliver a formal White House statement retracting any implication that Canadian provinces could or should join the United States. The statement must clearly affirm that Canada is a sovereign country whose territorial integrity is not open to American political opinion. There is no room for negotiation on this point. Demand 4, payment for economic harm. Carney said, the United States must make Canada whole for the economic losses triggered by those unlawful tariffs. Our estimate of the damage stands at $14.7 billion, covering lost trade volumes, broken supply chains, and expenses tied to forging new partnerships. Payment can take the form of trade credits, direct funds, or investments in Canadian border infrastructure, but the obligation must be recognized and settled. Demand 5, acknowledgement of Canadian resource control. Carney said, the United States must officially recognize that Canada's natural resources, including oil, natural gas, electricity, and critical minerals, belong to Canada and are marketed according to terms Canada sets. Any future requests for assured supply must be handled through commercial negotiations between equal sovereign nations, not enforced via political leverage. The United States must abandon any assertion of special or guaranteed access to Canadian resources. Subscribe now because what comes next are the consequences Carney warned would follow if these demands go unmet and why they would deliver devastating blows to the American economy. Carney stated that if the United States fails to satisfy all 5 conditions by March 18th at 5 p.m., Canada will put the following measures into effect without hesitation. He then detailed 6 actions that would amount to full-scale economic conflict. First, total cutoff of energy shipments to the United States. Carney said all exports of crude oil, natural gas, and electricity to the U.S. will cease at once. Canada will redirect those volumes to committed purchasers in Asia and Europe. This is not a bargaining tactic. This is the result. Second, formal exit from USMCA. Carney said Canada will trigger the withdrawal clause of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement and leave the pact effective immediately. Trade between the U.S. and Canada will then fall under WTO terms, bringing steep tariff hikes on American goods entering Canada and ending the preferred access U.S. firms currently hold. Third, restriction of airspace and sea lanes. Carney said Canada will bar U.S. commercial and military aircraft from our airspace unless each flight receives case-by-case clearance. We will also restrict Canadian maritime corridors, including the Northwest Passage and St. Lawrence Seaway, to vessels flying the U.S. flag. These steps will sharply raise costs and travel times for American shipping and aviation. Fourth, separation from U.S. financial systems. Carney said Canada will tighten existing financial limits by banning fresh Canadian investment in U.S. assets, mandating that Canadian pension funds and institutional investors unwind U.S. positions over 24 months, and imposing currency restrictions that curb conversion of Canadian dollars into U.S. dollars. This would pull roughly $480 billion in Canadian capital out of American markets. Fifth, full military disengagement. Carney said Canada will immediately halt all military collaboration with the United States. NORAD will be terminated. Joint drills will end. Canadian forces will pull out of every U.S. installation. Canada will develop standalone continental defense arrangements with NATO assistance and handle future security matters solely with European and Commonwealth allies. Sixth, coalition to resist U.S. economic pressure. Carney said Canada will partner with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and fellow democracies to create a structured mechanism for opposing American economic coercion. That mechanism will feature joint countermeasures against U.S. tariffs, mutual assistance for nations under U.S. pressure, and creation of trade and financial networks able to function without American involvement. Carney concluded his remarks. These are not warnings. They are promises. should the United States choose not to fulfill Canada's requirements by March 18th. These steps will begin at once and will remain in place until the United States proves, through consistent conduct over years, that it can once again be a dependable partner. The decision rests with America. Canada has already decided. We choose sovereignty, we choose independence, and we choose relationships grounded in equality and mutual respect. The United States now has 14 days to determine whether it wishes to join those relationships or whether it would rather stand apart from the single most significant bilateral tie it has ever known. Carney took his seat. The chamber rose and applauded for more than 3 minutes. Reaction 1, market turmoil. Almost instantly after the speech, American markets plunged into chaos. The Dow Jones shed 1,147 points within the first half hour of trading, a 3.2% drop. Energy shares cratered as investors began factoring in a potential halt to Canadian oil and gas flows within 2 weeks. Midwest and Northeast utilities tumbled as traders anticipated electricity shortfalls if Canadian power stops. Financial stocks took heavy losses as the market weighed the removal of $480 billion in Canadian money from U.S. investments. The S&P 500 closed down 4.1%, marking its worst single-day fall since the COVID period. The markets are signaling loud and clear that Carney's ultimatum carries weight and that the threatened actions would cripple the U.S. economy. Reaction 2, European backing. Less than 90 minutes after the address, the European Union released a statement. The European Union stands with Canada and views the 5 requirements set forth by Prime Minister Carney as fair and justified. We urge the United States to fulfill these requirements and renew the partnership that has benefited North America and the globe for generations. The EU is prepared to assist Canada in taking whatever steps are needed to protect its sovereignty. That declaration amounts to the EU openly supporting Carney's ultimatum and pledging help if the U.S. holds out. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom followed with their own statements aligning with the EU stance. Canada stands with powerful allies. It enjoys the support of the planet's largest economic bloc. Reaction 3, Pentagon concern. Sources report the Pentagon convened an urgent session right after the speech. Defense leaders expressed grave worry over the prospect of NORAD's dissolution, noting it would open enormous holes in continental air defense that would require years to repair. Their evaluation concludes that losing NORAD and Canadian military cooperation would eliminate northern early warning systems, disrupt coordinated Arctic air defense, and sever intelligence flows essential to homeland protection. Pentagon staff are said to be drafting a briefing for Trump that stresses accepting Carney's terms is critical for American security, and that the alternative, losing NORAD and defense ties with Canada, is strategically intolerable. Reaction 4, the 14-day strategy. Why exactly 14 days? Analysts say the deadline was chosen to generate peak pressure. 14 days gives Trump no credible claim of being caught off guard or denied time to reply, yet it's brief enough to block stalling, deflection, or letting the issue slip from public focus. March 18th lands on a Wednesday, midweek, ensuring markets stay active and attentive. The date also sits just before quarter end, so any looming loss of Canadian energy or market access will hit corporate earnings reports, intensifying business sector demands on Trump. Carney picked 14 days because it forces Trump into an immediate decision he wants to avoid. Here's the Washington response. At 10:15 a.m., the National Security Council met in emergency session. Sources describe the meeting as disorganized, with officials arguing over whether Carney's ultimatum was serious or a bluff, and whether Canada would truly carry out the promised actions. Intelligence assessments concluded Carney is fully serious, that Canada has spent 5 weeks preparing the necessary infrastructure, and that Canada has lined up enough global backing to weather the economic fallout far better than the U.S. could. At noon, Trump conferred with his economic team. Sources say he was informed that even partial implementation of Canada's measures would trigger an immediate recession an energy shortage, and a financial system meltdown. Trump reportedly inquired whether the U.S. could strike back harder. Advisors responded that effective retaliation is no longer possible because Canada has already secured substitute markets and international allies. At 2:00 p.m., the White House released a statement, firm in tone, yet containing no counteroffer and no sign of accepting Carney's conditions. At 3:30 p.m., congressional leaders from both parties put out a joint statement. Now let me outline 3 possible paths for March 18th. Scenario 1, full surrender. Confronted with economic meltdown, Pentagon warnings, congressional pushback, and Wall Street alarm, Trump agrees to every one of Carney's 5 demands. Tariffs vanish. NORAD receives the signed commitment. Trump delivers the public retraction. Compensation gets settled. Resource sovereignty is formally recognized. The crisis resolves, but Trump's political image lies in ruins. He has visibly yielded to Canada on live television, and his reputation for strength is irreparably damaged. Scenario 2, incomplete compliance. Trump accepts some demands but rejects others. He lifts tariffs and pledges NORAD continuity but refuses compensation or a sovereignty retraction. Carney responds with a proportional version of the threatened measures. Energy exports drop by half rather than stopping completely, and USMCA withdrawal moves forward.